more than 15 years ago, when I first thought of the ideas of comic books and anti-prison agitation and education, people thought that it was an unlikely match. And, but it seemed like a really good idea to me. My idea was to make comic books combining drawings, plain language to explain complex ideas and concepts. And the comic books are back there, and they're also online. So I wanted to incorporate statistics, new research, footnotes, but not scare off readers who are not used to reading academic articles and books. To do this, I thought they needed to be about people's lives, about stories. And I thought that the glossy covers might pass what I decided was like the laundromat test. If somebody was in the laundromat and they saw them, they would pick one up. You know, it would be that or People magazine, and they would pick the comic book up and read it. So my inspiration for comic books came from three sources. For more than 30 years, I used to go to Mexico all the time, and I used to see women tending stalls reading a photonovelas, which I'm sure you probably know about, and so they were everywhere, and they were inexpensive to produce and to buy. They were inexpensive, and they were just passed around. You know, as soon as one woman would just pass it to the next woman. So that was one idea that I had, and in 2000, I got these publications from a South African trade union. And one was about globalization, and one was about privatization. So it was like, you know, heavy stuff. But in these things that they produced, they used photos, and they used very concise explanations. And so they created these popular education materials that, like what I wanted, created these, used and made very complex ideas easy to understand. Their audience was South African trade unionists, and so were very politically astute, but maybe didn't have like really great reading skills. And that was my audience too. And then a field guide to the US economy used everyday language, graphs, and cartoons to explain how the economy works. And that book was written to illuminate the complexities of economics for people with no background in economics. So my goal was to create materials which organizers, educators, medical and mental health providers, along with people directly experiencing the impact of mass incarceration, which of course includes prisoners, could use to learn more and to inform the work that they were doing. I wanted them to be, are you Ruthie? Hi, Craig. This is Ruthie Gilmore, Craig Gilmore, and Craig is the co-author of the Prison Town comic book with Kevin, so it's very great that they're here. So I wanted to create materials that people who organizers could use and prisoners could use to learn more and inform their work. And I wanted them to be a resource for organizing and also for organizers themselves, since often people focused on one area, say the war on drugs, and knew little about the realities for women who are incarcerated or what the consequences of building new jails and prisons was on communities. And so, confession to maybe a lot of people here, I wasn't then, and I am not now, an expert on comic books. I mean, this was my local mentality, and I didn't even get to it through a comic book door in a way. No, I got to it in this other way. So the comic books are one part of the Real Cost of Prisons project, which began in 2000 and grew to include 3 workshops, one of which Craig did, and the comic books, a website, and over the years, a great deal of organizing in Massachusetts and around the country. The comic books were designed to be a resource for people fighting for saner sentencing and less prison and jail building. Since their publication in 2005, tens of thousands of comic books were used by programs working with youth. Thousands of comic books have been used by health educators and providers, including training for rural and urban health practitioners in GED classes in high schools and drug treatment programs. And hundreds of organizations, big and small, use the comic books in workshops, outreach, organizing against new prison building, ending mandatory sentences, and more. So prison politicizes many prisoners. Some prisoners are fortunate to have families and support systems that provide magazine subscriptions and send books and newspaper articles. However, in this age of information overload, our information overload in the quote free world, prisoners are without access to the internet, and they're starved for new information, new research, and political material. The only way that they get it is if somebody sends it to them, or if they do happen to have a subscription to something which takes money, which most people can't make in prison if they're making 10 or 15 cents an hour. So it's very hard to get materials. Unfortunately, many organizations have stopped printing hard copies of their reports, fact sheets, and resources. More and more research important to prisoners is available only on websites, making it almost impossible for people who are incarcerated to have access to the materials they need to continue their own education, help with other people's education, and to do organizing work that they do inside and outside of prisons. The comic books reflect the lives of many prisoners and speak to their experience, and they were free and available. That's like kind of the bottom line, free and available. Tens of thousands of comic books have been received by prisoners in every state prison system, every federal prison, and many, many jails. I know that comic books are still passed hand to hand by prisoners, because I still get letters every single day saying, please send me a set of comic books. I just saw them on somebody's bunk, or somewhere or other floating around prison. And so, I mean, I still get those. I get those letters literally every day. So word of the comic book spread from prisoners to their families, friends, and organizations with which they work. In response to the comic books, I began to receive a wealth of insightful political writing and comics from prisoners. I get these letters like, well, I do this, do you want to see it? And yeah, I do. So that inspired me to create 2 sections of the Real Cost Prisons website, writing from prison, comics from inside, and these old scenes are from 3 of the guys whose work is on that, and I'll show some of their work and talk about them. So the comic books have connected me with hundreds and hundreds of politicized prisoners, and that has transformed the work I do. The cartoon, and so you'll get an idea of what it's like, what they're like. Okay, so this is me, but without the. This is how Willie Worley imagines me at home.
The slippers.
Yeah, I like the slippers. The shirt, not so much, but the slippers.
You didn't wear them?
Yeah, if only. Hilarious, that would be great. No, yeah, anyway, so Willie Worley, a lot of his work is on the website. I totally love his work, and I love him. And he's in North Carolina, and he's very, 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 very prolific. He's been in solitary many times since I've known him. And so these are just, this is, a tiny sample. If you go to the website, I have hundreds and hundreds of his cartoons up there. And he takes a lot of risk doing what he does, just like everybody whose work I'm going to show you. Okay, this woman, Anna Lucia Kelhart, she was incarcerated in Texas. She was there for a very, very long time. And I hadn't heard from her in a really long time. And I thought that was weird, and I sent her a letter, and I got back this thing that was written across it, deceased. And actually, some relative of hers just contacted me to see if I knew what had happened to her. This was a number of years ago, and I don't have any idea what. She was in her 70s, but but she was incarcerated for many, many years, and she has these wild. I mean, a lot of them are on the website. She has these like wild cartoons, and with these all of these different. She has these different strips, character strips, kind of that. And if you're interested, you can check them out more. She's just a wild woman. This guy is in Pennsylvania, and he does these kind of strips like this. He was in solitary for many, many years, and he finally got out. And he had a terrible time adjusting to being in, he was in solitary, and then he was suddenly in the general population, which meant there were a lot of people around him all the time, from going from nobody around him to many, many people around him. And so he was really freaked out, and like he was afraid that people were coming up against him, and he was in solitary for like 10 or 12 years. So Carnell, when he first contacted me, he was in Connecticut, and then he got moved to Massachusetts. So I live in Massachusetts, so I could see him in Connecticut. I could see him in Massachusetts. Now he's been moved to New Mexico, so he's in a private prison company called Geo in New Mexico, and he's gotten into deep, 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 deep shit because of his cartoons. And those envelopes that I sent around, I mean, that's an example. He really decided he wasn't going to do it when he got to this new prison, and then he couldn't resist. And, I mean, it's a way for Carnell to be Carnell. He's funny, he's smart. It's a way for him, it's a way for him to be himself. And so even though, I mean, when he was in Connecticut, they almost killed him. I mean, they were, beat the shit out of him. He was in 4-point restraints. The guards, like these same kind of guards that are probably going to do it to him in New Mexico because of these cartoons. Like this. And so, he hates the guards for good reason, and that this is the way it comes out. He ostensibly is going to be paroled he's in his 50s now. I think theoretically he can come up for parole in, I think, about 15 years. He's been in there forever. And he's a great guy. I mean, obviously, I think all these guys are great guys. I always say, oh, great guy. So this is somebody named Richard Hall. He's in California. I had asked a couple of different people who are cartoonists. It drives me crazy, like the language, where now a prison or everything is called a facility. Like a jail is a facility, a prison's a facility, where you go to the gym is a facility, everything is a facility. So that you have like there's no, you can't differentiate between a jail and like where you go to work out. It's all a facility. So this was one of these words that just really bugged me. And so I wrote to a couple of people and I said, could you do a cartoon for me about this language? And so Richard did this one about, facility watch, facility. And this is his character, his cartoon character that he has a lot of cartoons about. And he was in prison in California, and he would be writing me periodically, oh, I'm going to be up for parole, and then the governor, he was up for parole, the governor didn't sign the parole thing. He appealed the parole, and he keeps writing me these letters, I'm going to be paroled, I'm going to be paroled, and I thought to myself, he's never going to be paroled. And so around last year, around Christmas time, I sent him a Christmas card. I have a file cabinet filled with his work, right? So I sent him a Christmas card, and it came back like a week later. It's paroled. I was like, my God. And like right after that, I get this phone call from Richard. You know, I mean, it was like, you know, he like materialized on the outside. And so he's living in LA. And he was a vet, so he got Section 8 housing, which is pretty amazing. And so he seems to be, I hope, doing well. Okay, this is somebody that I hardly know at all, but he sent me this cartoon, which I like. He's locked up in Pennsylvania. And so here's more from Jacob. I love this cartoon. The end.
As someone said in the introduction, I'm one of the longtime co-editors of World War III Illustrated, and so I started doing politically oriented comics a long time ago. What I found interesting about working on this with Lois is, we produce, World War III has been around for a very long time, and we get sometimes in museum shows, or we get in anthologies, things like that, and it's been a great experience. But this was the first kind of comic experience where I saw like real effects of, because of the distribution and because it was so sort of pointed towards a very clear idea. It was an incredibly effective. When you start to do comics about things like power and exploitation and trying to expose some of the things that drive you crazy about our own society, it's great to show them to other people who feel the same way, but it's a whole nother feeling to know that they're getting out there, to over 100,000 people, which is just a totally different experience. And I think I remember when you started distributing, there was one story about legislators like reading them on the steps of a Capitol before they're voting on prison issues. That's the one I always go to.
It was this guy who was because I had sent them to, he had given them to legislators. Yeah. And he took a picture, and there was a hearing, and they were all had like surreptitiously reading the comic.
Yeah, so that's just fantastic. I think that's great. So. And as you probably, Lois didn't say it, but as you probably get the idea just from her passion about it, she was incredibly dedicated on this project and just great to work with, as you would imagine. But anyway, so yeah, Lois brought me in. As it turns out, my comic was the first one published, but I was the second one brought into it. And so I'm just going to talk about this particular comic and then the other activist comics I've done that have sort of come out of this. So Prison Town is about the siting and financing of prisons, and it was written with the help of prison activist Craig Gilmore. Having Craig there on the process was really helpful for me. As a comic artist, when you start to get interested in these different subject matter, you sort of have to, if you want to be accurate and understand and put this work out there in a way that feels legitimate to the people who really know the issue, it's very helpful to have someone like Craig who could read what I was doing and being like, well, that makes sense. That's not so. That doesn't happen so much. So the way I ended up deciding to approach Prison Town, because it was about the siting and financing of prisons, was I came up with this approach of like a typical like fictionalized town, where the policy would play out. So I kind of structured the comic as a before and after sort of situation. So, and I knew I wanted to try to find a way to move through the town. So you all probably don't know my previous work, but it's this book called Lab USA, which is all declassified documents and really has the feeling of a documentary. And it's strange in the sense that it has no central characters. So even though this seems odd, this was a breakthrough for me to have a central character, like a boy. Like there's a boy like riding his bike through a landscape, and for me this was like a great invention. So anyway, he's riding through the town. You see, as typical to prison towns, maybe the agricultural base has collapsed or the industrial base has collapsed, and he's going. You're seeing the closed up storefronts. This is actually from the town I was living in at the time in New Jersey, where I just made everything look like it was closed up. And so then you see the town elders talking about what they're going to do, and they're discussing the idea of bringing in a prison. Now my work about these sort of issues is very research-based, and I find it can be really helpful to inform the storytelling. And basically this boy ends up riding outside of town and goes up to this bluff, and he's looking up at the stars. And it's kind of this sort of metaphor of, you know, you see your future in the stars sort of idea. But this came from reading some research that I think Craig had sent me about Susanville, California, which was this town that became a prison town. And one of the beloved local activities was they'd ride up to this bluff and look up at the stars. It was just kind of like something that happened in that town. So this is one of those instances where like reading a lot of different research kind of helps you to form the story. So basically the story's broken up with some infographics, which I'll show in a minute. But then you get to the after the prison, where the is built, and the economic promises that aren't really fulfilled. You know, prison guards typically commute. They don't end up spending a lot of money in a prison town. Services like uniforms and food, even what's been promised to the town, those are all, you know, contracted at state and national, you know, corporate level. So it doesn't really have a positive economic impact on the town like it's promised. But meanwhile, it has an increased need for social services, security in high schools, and it also kind of brings this whole sort of climate of fear, I think, to these different towns. So the way I decided to sort of talk about these different issues like floating bonds or the increased demand on utilities or waste disposal is just sort of you know, landscape shots of the town, of the different architecture and sites that represent those various issues, talking about how property values go down, things like that. Another effect is like really increased traffic, these small towns that now have this big rush hour going through them. So in the end, the boy is riding up past all this traffic, and he rides up to the bluff, and now the stars have been eclipsed by the light of the prison, which is actually what happened in Susanville, California. So this kind of gives you an idea of how you can take sort of the idea, you know, all the statistics of siting and financing of prisons and kind of structure it into a narrative and a story, which is really what Lois is, one of the first things she talked to us about is, you know, how are we going to take this material and have it be so people want to read it, which is really the brilliant sort of turn on the whole idea of her deciding to translate this material into comics, is that, you know, people will spend a lot more time with the comic than, or some people will spend more time with the comic than they would with a lot of pamphlets and information. So some of the challenges of making comics like this, where you've got tons of information, it's actually really challenging in comics in general to leave enough room for your pictures. I find when I work with writers, that like they'll say, "Oh, this is the first panel," and it's like 6 lines of text. And it's like, well, there's no room for the pictures. So you end up coming up with strategies when you do have a lot of text, like this is about, you know, focusing on different parts of the country, and then you can sort of end up coming up with sort of infographic type strategies to get across a lot of information in a still kind of hopefully graphically pleasing way. So maps are really helpful for that. This is a flow chart of the how prisons are paid for. What's that say? Paid for, and who really pays. I happen to be a fan of these, like the 1950s, 60s Fortune magazines would have these crazy business diagrams in them. If you look back when, you know, they're really kind of beautiful to look at. So I kind of tried to do something like that with this, where take these really complex issues of like where the money comes from with the taxes and what the effects are and how it all plays out in the bond. And I remember it gave me I remember when you said, well, we need a comic about this subject. And I was reading it, and I was sweating and losing sleep. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And then suddenly the idea of this infographic chart came to me. And as you'll see in some other stuff, I've kind of used it. You know, this chart gets used, but the whole idea of the chart gets used by me a lot because it's a really helpful way to get across this kind of information. So the comic, yeah, has infographics in it like this. I think this breaks up the before and after story, I think. And then what it has is the last comic is, which I'll actually read, is at the end of the book. It's kind of an alternative to this way of, you know, to incarceration. Kind of given the shift in the political climate, maybe this is just one sort of way to go with alternatives to incarceration. So it's called $1 Million Blocks. There are blocks in Brooklyn, New York, and other places where the government is spending $1 million a year. The money is not being spent on drug treatment programs. It's not being spent on prenatal care or health care. It's not being spent on education or job training. it's being spent on imprisonment. In the US, 58% of people are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. In New York, 75% of the prisoners come from 7 African American and Latino neighborhoods. People of color make up 87% of the New York prison population growth since the 1970s. 65% of female U.S. state prisoners have young children. 87% of prisoners in New York are caged more than 2 hours from New York City. All right, darlings, suit up. It's time to go. Auntie. Not a good actor, sorry. There's little evidence that removing so many people from a community makes it safer. In fact, given the higher concentration of people being locked up from targeted neighborhoods, the opposite appears to be true. When you turn someone into a prisoner, you put them on a road that is very hard to get off. 2 in 3 people will end up back in prison, half of those due to parole violations, not new crime. When you turn someone into a prisoner, you transfer their economic and social power, real or potential, to the people who build and work in the prisons. When you turn someone into a prisoner, they can no longer vote, take care of their kids, or provide for their family. With each person removed from a community, the social and economic bonds break down a little more. With 98% of people leaving prison returning to the same unchanged block, a place without jobs, effective drug counseling, or affordable housing, does it make sense to spend $1 million this way? So what if the money was being spent on other things? In Oregon and Ohio, programs are attempting to change this by rechanneling money back into the high crime areas. In Dutchess County, the state turned over the cost of locking up youth, $50,000 per youth per year, to the county. By making local officials and parole officers responsible for specific communities, they have provided a direct incentive to make the streets safer. The county had the less violent youths serve their sentences by performing community service, which reduced the youth imprisonment by 72%. They also saved $17,000 per case that they could reinvest in schools, libraries, drug treatment, and other programs. Research shows that quality education is one of the most effective forms of crime prevention, and drug treatment programs cost much less than imprisonment. So instead of removing people, the community seeks to help them stay out of prison in the community where they belong. So these are what the full pages look like in that. So yeah, as I already said, this was incredibly satisfying due to Lois's hard work and like the amount of distribution. I think a really fascinating thing that has happened afterwards is Lois's sort of relationship with these prisoners and the way that's sort of taken it to a whole other step. I had a little bit of a taste of that when I was, one of the earliest issues I edited for World War III was an issue on prisons. I think that was like maybe 1994, something like that, 1996, somewhere around there. And one of the ideas we had is we wrote letters. We got letters from prisoners that we gave to the different artists in World War III Illustrated, and they illustrated the comics that prisoners had written. And for this first issue, I did a fair amount of comics about prison issues. I co-edited this with Scott Cunningham. And a lot of that material ended up being collected in Lab USA. And Lab USA was my first sort of big book. Published by Altana Media. It's kind of it's a nonfiction, what I call docucomic, about the history of clandestine medical research done by governments. It's all very fully footnoted. Everything, most of it's all reported. It's got a lot, I call it illuminated documents because it's got a lot of declassified documents in it. And it kind of traces the history from post-slavery medical. You know, there is an oral history in the beginning that is not that well documented, but the story of medical towns in Baltimore and Philadelphia where freed slaves were being abducted off the street and maybe ended up in medical schools. But then that's one of the most anecdotal ones, but it goes all the way up to genetic technology. But like I said, it was all very well footnoted and everything like that. But because it was all about this testing being done on marginalized populations, of course it ended up having a lot of stuff about prisons in it. Like I said, a lot of which was published in World War III. But some of the other subjects were, there's a piece on stun belt technology. I don't know if a lot of people know about stun belts, or if, I'm not even sure if they're getting used as much as they were at one time. There's a comic about control units. Another comic, this one up here, is about how the exploitation of prisoners as a cheap blood source actually led to the spread of HIV among hemophiliacs, which is still very underreported story. And then this one was about the sort of gruesome and profitable skin experiments by Dr. Albert Kligman, which was done at Holmesburg Prison. He actually invented Retina A, which is like he was a very well-known dermatologist who made tons and tons of money. But what's interesting about all these stories is they're pretty well documented in places like the New York Times and things like that, but they just don't sort of seep into the larger public consciousness because they really do have the feel of conspiracy. And prisons, I think, is still where a lot of, I think they kind of, to me, they feel like the stories about prisoners or the reality of prison is that the mass amount of people don't actually want to know about it. I think what you were saying before is, you know, if I just tell people about these things, then things will change. But unfortunately, there's a very large amount of the population that doesn't really even want to know about it. But it's interesting you bring that up because there's a great book called Bury the Chains about the abolition movement and I think the central premise of liberalism or that strain of activism is if you introduce people to knowledge that shows the inhumanity of man to man, that something will change and something will happen. So it's especially disconcerting when you do come across people where it just doesn't matter to them. But anyway, so there's one strip in this which I'll show you guys that's also prison related. It's called On the Road. As a prisoner in America, one is afforded certain rights under the law: access to medical care, freedom to practice religion, the right to talk to the press, etc. From the administration perspective, the assertion of these rights, as well as any attempt to organize fellow prisoners, is to be discouraged. Because official punitive actions are subject to outside review, unofficial methods of discouragement must be devised. One such method is known by the name diesel therapy. Diesel therapy is an extended administrative transfer usually preceded and followed by 3 months of solitary confinement before release into the new population and the accompanying stress of having to prove oneself to these new prisoners. Prisoners are often chained while in transit, subject to frequent strip searches, and entitled to only one hot meal a day. They have no contact with friends or family, no access to books or possessions, and often they have no knowledge of where they are, where they're going, and when they'll arrive. These transfers can extend beyond a year, though 3 to 6 months is the time most often reported. There's a lot worse things they can do to you. One of the few advantages is getting to see some scenery. The not knowing where you're going, for how long, their attempts to keep you from contacting your family through all this, it's all meant to break you down. Luckily, I'm very hard and belligerent, and they still haven't broken me. All quotes by prisoners who've experienced this diesel therapy. So one of the reasons I like to show this comic is because it's one of the few comics where I actually felt like I did a lot of original research on it, because I would go to these activists, when I started to get interested in these subjects, I typically try to read different books about them, articles, etc. And I would go to prison activist meetings, and I hear about this term diesel therapy, which kind of appealed to my dark imagination, especially at this time. I'm like, oh, what is that? And I could find very little about it online. People would talk about it a little bit here and there. So what I did is I ended up writing letters to prison activists, newspapers like Prison Legal News. I think Jim Campbell was one guy, and I'm trying to remember who a couple different people who had a lot of contact with prisoners, and they placed ads in newspapers. And I started to get these letters actually by people who experienced this. And so the quotes from the comic are from those folks. And I was able to really construct the text of the comic based on the information I could get from these different letters that people wrote. The other reason I love this comic is because it's one of those comics where you know, I could expose something that I didn't feel like a lot of people knew about, but I could also create something with this information that I felt had an emotional truth to it, and it kind of also existed on an aesthetic level. It was as satisfying for me as an artist. I think that can be a struggle as someone who does political art, is sometimes you in order to get across information, you put aside certain aesthetic strategies that you want to put aside. But this one, for some reason, the idea of just showing what the prisoner saw out the window, it kind of got at this emotional truth that they were feeling, this sort of sense of vulnerability. And for me, that sort of landscape as metaphor was a really satisfying as an artist. But it also, like I said, got across an idea that was really, or a story that I thought was really important.